Hello, everyone. Welcome to ICAS Experts Voice Initiative Program. My name is Nong Hong from the Institute for China-American Studies based in Washington, D.C. The EVI is a series of in-depth interviews with leading global experts exploring critical international relations and issues that shape our world today. Starting early this year, ICAS launched a new series of EVI with a focus on the Arctic. The idea is to host leading Arctic experts from the 5 Arctic coastal states and other stakeholder nations to share their research and expertise on a wide range of issues on the Arctic, including politics, law, governance, climate change, indigenous people, among others. So far, our EVI Arctic series has explored this critical issue through 4 countries' perspectives: Canada, China, United States, and Russia. We have so far released 4 thought-provoking episodes that have sparked meaningful discussion and positive feedback. Today, it's my great honor to welcome Dr. Rasmus Bertelsen, who will bring a vital Norwegian perspective to the conversation. As the professor of Northern Studies and Bertelsen Chair in Politics at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, his expertise promises a unique insight into Norway's role in Arctic governance, Arctic international relations, and beyond. Welcome, Dr. Bertelsen.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to contribute to your program.
Thank you. So we will start by talking about Norway's Arctic strategy. As one major coastal state of Norway, how would you describe Norway's overall Arctic strategy? Have you seen any significant development or shift in Norway's approach to Arctic in the recent years?
The Russian 2022 invasion of Ukraine, it has been a watershed in Norwegian Arctic affairs because Norway, of course, is a neighboring country of Russia. It has a land border of 170 something kilometers, and it has a maritime border of thousands of kilometers. And being the neighbor of Russia, and before this, historically the neighbor of the Soviet Union, that very much shapes Norwegian foreign and security policy. And Norway, until 2022, very much pursued a policy of cooperation with Russia. Norway pursued a double policy of both deterrence, and it was a policy stretching back to the Cold War, a double policy of deterrence, national defense, NATO membership, very close bilateral, especially intelligence cooperation with the United States. That was the deterrence bit. And then there was also a reassurance bit and a cooperation bit with Russia, in different ways, reassuring Russia, reassuring the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Norway placed limitations on its military forces close to the Soviet border. Norway placed limitations on NATO presence close to the Soviet border. After the Cold War, Norway invested a good deal in Barents cooperation with Russia. I myself benefited very much from that. I used to have very, very good collaboration with Russian institutions. My university here, the UiT, the Arctic University, the Arctic University of Norway, one of the 4 main universities of Norway. We had very high-level partnerships in Russia. And after the February 2022 invasion by Russia of Ukraine, Norway, together with the rest of NATO, with Norway following the European Union, Norway responded by cutting off almost all its collaboration with Russia. So now the Norwegian Arctic policy, there's very, very, very little left of the old cooperation with Russia in science and other things. And now it's very much oriented towards NATO. It's very much oriented towards North America. And the NATO membership by Sweden and Finland has also changed a lot of things. Maybe we touch upon that later in our discussion. But now the fact that all 5 Nordic countries are members of NATO, that also changes a lot for Norwegian foreign and security policy up here.
That's a very good start. And before we move on to a further detailed discussion on Russia, let me ask you about the Svalbard Treaty in 1922. So my understanding is that the Svalbard Treaty one hand recognized Norwegians and sovereignty while guaranteed a non-discriminatory access to resources for other treaty members. And then Norway limits these provisions to land and territorial waters. And then there is a lot of debates over all the maritime rights over the land and territorial waters. And how does Norway align its interpretation with UNCLOS-based rights? And what are the implications for Norway's approach to the Arctic governance?
Well, 2 observations first. One is that I'm a professor here since good 10 years ago. But I'm a Danish national myself, so I somehow see these Norwegian affairs a little bit from the outside. And the other provision is that I am a political scientist. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a legal scholar of the Svalbard Treaty or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And as you say, the Svalbard Treaty, it gives sovereignty over Svalbard to Norway. The Svalbard Treaty of 1920, which took effect 1925, if I understand correctly. I mean, and of course, this treaty, to some extent, it creates, as far as I can see, it creates a certain conflict of interest between Norway and all the other treaty states, because Norway is extremely attentive to protect its sovereignty. Norway is extremely attentive to protect its control on Svalbard. And of course, many of the other treaty states, their interest is to maximize their access, maximize access to location, maximize access to resources. So in that way, the treaty creates a certain tension between Norway and everybody else. And of course, Norway has long-standing disagreement with the European Union about interpreting the continental shelf around Svalbard. And as I say, I'm not a lawyer myself, but I notice this conflict of interest. And then, of course, it also becomes difficult because Svalbard is located. I suspect I'm not a geologist either, but I suspect there could be valuable subsoil hydrocarbon resources around Svalbard. And there, in a way, the Svalbard Treaty, if I understand correctly, it creates another conflict, that because Norway is not allowed to tax activities under the Svalbard Treaty and use those tax revenues outside Svalbard. I mean, Norway, of course, has benefited enormously from its offshore oil and gas resources. And those oil and gas resources they're taxed very heavily, and the proceeds go into the Norwegian Petroleum Fund, which is an incredibly successful sovereign wealth fund. And if we imagine that there was oil and gas on Svalbard, around Svalbard, and if we imagine that access was given to develop this, and and Norway would not be allowed to tax it, or only very, very little, and that all the treaty states would have equal access, then of course it becomes extremely lucrative. It becomes potentially very interesting. But then also Svalbard is in a strategically extremely sensitive area. And that's, of course, I mean, Svalbard in so many ways controls access to the Barents Sea area. And what, in my view, is the key to Arctic security questions, Arctic security concerns, it is the US-Russia mutual nuclear deterrence. It was so during the Cold War, and it continues to do so. And now, with this Ukrainian drone attack on Russian strategic bombers, well, we are reminded of strategic stability. We are reminded of the global importance of mutual deterrence. And there, the Barents Sea is extremely important. The Barents Sea, the Kara Sea, is extremely important for Russia's nuclear deterrent, submarine-based nuclear deterrent. And the United States, since the Cold War, stresses the Soviet Northern Fleet, the Russian Northern Fleet, stresses it maximum or significantly. So for Russia, how to say, to keep the dangerous enemy, which is the United States, out of Svalbard is extremely important. So, and then you have particular scientific possibilities there. You have dual use scientific possibilities, perhaps concerning space research, which makes access to Svalbard very important for certain strategic science topics concerning space that perhaps have dual use application. So you have, because of the treaty, because of natural resources, because of geostrategic concerns, because of strategic science, a lot of things get very complicated and very sensitive concerning Svalbard.
Yeah, I think that's a very comprehensive way to expand this question. And I appreciate you provide a historical context and a geopolitical context, explain the issue. My understanding actually it represents a very typical example of how to balance and how to how to interpret the old treaty, like we say Svalbard Treaty and the new treaty. It's a very traditional legal question. Thank you very much. And then can we move on to for discussion on the relationship with between Norway and Russia? You mentioned a little bit earlier that there's no more cooperation between Russia and Norway at this moment after 2022. So then what were the area for cooperation before the 2022 between the two countries? Are there any technical or scientific or other areas of cooperation?
As I say, during the Cold War, Norway had, in my view, a very sophisticated dual policy of both deterrence and reassurance. And I think it was a very sophisticated policy, and I think many people didn't understand that policy very well, and I think Norway is moving away from that policy, and I think that's risky to do. And I think if you want to move away from that policy, you have to understand very well what the old policy was about, and you have to understand very well the risks of moving away from it. And as I say, I mean, an element of deterrence, Norway deterring the Soviet Union, but also this element of reassurance that the Kola Peninsula is crucial to Soviet and Russian defense. And Russia is so enormous. Russia is 17 million kilometers, 17 million square kilometers. I think China is 9 million square kilometers. Russia is almost twice the size of China. And that, of course, means that Russia has an enormous amount of space. And in Russian strategic thinking, I think there's often, historically, there has been this thinking of you can trade space for time or time for space. So when Russia has been invaded, Russia absorbs the attack. 1812, Napoleon, 1941, Nazi Germany. And then Russia can absorb the attack and exhaust the attacker and then roll back. And there are a few places where Russia does not have strategic depth. This ability to just withdraw, exhaust the opponent and counterattack. And the Kola Peninsula is one of these places. Because the Norwegian-Russian border is so close to Murmansk, it's so close to Severomorsk, the main base of the Russian Northern Fleet. And that means that Russia is very, very sensitive. The Soviet Union was very, very sensitive what's close to these areas. And I think Norway understood that very well during the Cold War, and that's why Norway had these limitations on placing Norwegian, allowing NATO forces close to the Norway-Soviet border. It was not, how to say, a reward of the Soviet Union. It was understanding what is perceived as very threatening by the other side and making sure that the other side does not unnecessarily feel attacked or threatened. And then after the end of the Cold War, where of course in the West we had, and not least in Europe, we had very, very strong expectations about the end of history, that this whole old-fashioned realist international political system that was behind us, and now we were going to have globalization, liberalization, and everybody was going to become like the West, including China. And that, of course, was wishful thinking on Western behalf. But Norway, from the 90s, engaged in a lot of collaboration with Russia in the Barents region. And of course, in the 1990s, Russia was in an incredibly deep social crisis. So in the beginning, a lot of this Norwegian collaboration, it was almost humanitarian assistance. And then, of course, the partnership became more and more equal. And Norway really did invest significantly in environmental collaboration, cultural collaboration, educational collaboration, scientific collaboration. Business collaboration was more difficult. And I should not forget the fisheries collaboration, which is very important, but I'll get back to that. But what is very interesting to see about a lot of this collaboration Norway invested in with Russia from the 90s until 2022, it was the Norwegian expectations that from Norwegian side, there were, if we look at it from international relations theory, I would say there were very strong liberal expectations and very strong constructivist expectations. Liberal expectations that you are going to shape Russian society in a more liberal democratic way. And by making Russia a more liberal democratic society, you make the world safer for Norway. And then there was what I would say constructivist thinking that it was very important to create this common Barents identity between northern Norway and northwest Russia. And of course, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all this implodes, these expectations, these Norwegian assumptions, they turn out to be completely unfounded. And I mean, listening to Norwegian debate about this since February 2022, where all these expectations, which turned out to be completely unfounded, that this would contribute to a liberalization of Russian society, and this would contribute to creating a common identity, and that this would have effects on Russian foreign and security policy. Well, the question why Russia invaded Ukraine, that's a very big and extremely important question. But it's clear that, how to say, the reasons for which Russia invaded Ukraine were a lot more important to Russia than, let's say, cross-border school collaboration with Norway. Personally, but as I say, I see this from the outside, and I see it differently. I mean, I think this Norwegian collaboration was a huge success. I mean, many people around me, they think it was a complete fiasco because it did not change Russian society. But I think it was completely unrealistic to think that this kind of collaboration would change Russian society. I think it was a great success because Norway, small state neighboring Russia, Norway needs to have a lot of insight into Russia, a lot of access, a lot of networks, a lot of experience with Russia. And when I started connecting with Tromsø all the way back in 2011, the first thing I noted as a Danish was that at the university here in Tromsø, at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, at the University Hospital for Northern Norway, at the Norwegian Polar Institute, at the Arctic Frontiers Conference, the Aquaplan Niva company, which is the parent company of the Arctic Frontiers Conference. In these institutions, you had an incredible experience concerning Russia, insight, access, and network. And I mean, teaching here, my students, young people from Northern Norway, they would have a lot more insight and experience with Russian society than, let's say, young Danish people, because they had taken part in various exchange programs between teenagers in Northern Norway and Northwest Russia. So these people, they had experiences and impressions of Russia, and we had fantastic networks, very high-level networks concerning Russia. But of course, in my view, it was completely unfounded to think that this Norwegian collaboration policy would shape or influence Russian society. And this is something I find very important and interesting to discuss. So Nonghong, now I forgot your original question. You'll have to get me back on track.
So you answered perfectly. I think I understand. I agree with you that Norway plays a very important role by playing the dual role of deterrence and dialogue. And I think you perfectly answered the question. Now, I would like to, you mentioned a little bit about the relationship between Norway and United States. I'm just wondering, do you see any change of the bilateral relation, particularly under the Trump administration, the Norway and US policy on the Arctic or in general?
Norway is a very transatlantic country. Norway has very, very strong cultural, political, economic ties to Britain and to the United States. And the Nordic countries in general are very transatlantic countries, very Anglo-Saxon oriented countries. But I think Denmark is, of course, closer to continental Europe, etc. But and in the case of Norway, I mean, for example, the Second World War experience with Britain, the United States, it's extremely important. And I alluded to that it's not something that gets much attention, but during the Cold War and continuing until this day, Norway and the United States has a very, very deep bilateral intelligence collaboration concerning the Arctic. Because northern Norway being so close to the Kola Peninsula, northern Norway during the Cold War and continuously, it gives, in partnership with Norwegian military intelligence, it gives the United States unique access to being close to the Kola Peninsula. And also, culturally, Norway is very oriented towards Britain, the United States. And it's the same thing in Denmark. So the Trump phenomena is an enormous shock for these countries. It's an enormous shock. So for many, many, many countries around the world, for lots of people around the world who are used to be subjected to American military force, economic coercion, etc., it may not be as big a difference. But for these Nordic countries, which in many ways had fallen so much in love with the United States, culturally, politically, economically, this is an unbelievable shock. And you hear all the time, you hear people say, what happened to the United States? Where did the United States go? Because in Norway, there was such a strong image of a fundamentally benign United States. And as I say, there's a lot of people in the world who have very good reason not to have an image of a benign United States. But for the Norwegians, for the Danes, they had built up this extremely strong image of a benign United States. And in the case of Denmark, Denmark really, really thought we had a particular friendship with the United States. It's almost like when a person falls very much in love with an idol and thinks that that idol loves the fan back. And then you suddenly realize that the idol doesn't care about you at all. I mean, of course, that's the case of Greenland. It's the absurd example. But for Norway, Trump is an enormous shock. But there are so many things that just go on. So, for example, this very deep intelligence collaboration, I'm sure it goes on, nothing changed. All kinds of military collaboration. And of course, Europe at the same time, Europe has over decades always chosen deeper and deeper dependence on the United States. Deeper and deeper intellectual dependence, material dependence. And now, with the war in Ukraine, Europe feels so extremely threatened by Russia. It's another very important question. I mean, the big question these days is, why did Russia invade Ukraine? What are Russian war aims? If Russian war aims are very limited, that's very important. If they are broader, that's very important. And of course, many people in Europe, they think that Russia has very broad war aims. And you hear people talking about Russia invading other countries after Ukraine. Personally, I think Russia has very specific, very limited war aims in Ukraine, concerning neutralizing Ukraine and the question of the eastern parts of Ukraine. Personally, I don't think Russia has war aims beyond that. But a lot of people in Europe are convinced that Russia has war aims beyond that. And that, of course, coupled with deep, deep, deep dependence on the United States, that makes for a very stressful situation.
I think, yeah, the talk on purchasing Greenland is not only a shock for Denmark, for Norway and other Nordic states, a shock for the world. Okay, so now I would like to ask you about how do you describe the relationship among the Arctic states, like Norway with Canada, and Norway with Denmark, and other Arctic Council member states, Finland or Sweden. How would you describe the relationships? And when these countries approach Arctic governor, are there any differences or are there any challenge, diverse approach?
The five Nordic countries, of course, they're very similar societies in size. Well, Iceland is a lot smaller, 370,000 people, something like that. Sweden is the biggest, I think around 10 million people. Denmark, Finland, Norway, 5-6 million people. They are very highly developed societies. They have very similar social models, the social democratic welfare state. They are in many ways very successful, innovative societies. They have, I mean, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, we have mutually readable, understandable languages, ethnically, religiously, etc. We are very, very similar, very similar. It's probably almost like neighboring provinces in China, different dialects, but otherwise very similar. So a lot of things between the Nordic countries are very easy. And then Canada, which in many ways is, I mean, the Canadian social model, more welfare state oriented, etc., culturally, etc. I think many Europeans, many Northern Europeans find Canada a very similar society, very easy to relate to. And we used to find the United States easy and to deal with, but that was maybe because we had created a certain image of the United States that we were very much in love with. And as I say, I mean, the United States has been nice to the Nordic countries, has been nice to Europe, but of course, using military force and economic coercion, that's something the United States does on a daily basis around the world. And when you look at the 8 Arctic countries, I mean, Russia was in many ways always the other, the one that's different. And it was, I mean, I appreciated very much collaboration with Russia before, but that was another great advantage of this Norwegian investment in working with Russia, that you created, and it was very evident here in Tromsø, you created a substantial group of people who were experienced working with Russia. And that's a big difference from Norway and the other Nordic countries. That, of course, Finland has a very particular historical relationship with Russia and a very, very apprehensive relationship. Finland has very good reasons to fear Russia in many ways. And I think Finland handled those threats very well before. I think Finland's heavily armed neutrality before, I think it was a I think it was in many ways a good way of handling that. Now we'll see if NATO membership, if it brings Finland more security or if it brings more tension. It probably brings both, but the question is, does it bring marginally more security and a lot more tension, or much more security at a acceptable cost of tension? And again, of course, I mean, how to say, the Western standard view is that it's all Russia's fault. It's all Russia's fault. Sure, Russia decided to invade Ukraine, but the West is responsible for how it decides to respond to that, and the wisdom of its strategic responses. No, so this thing about experience working with Russia, where Norway and Norwegian government system, they had a lot of experience working with Russia. I think the fact that it was Norway that was chair of the Arctic Council after Russia, I think that was very, very good, because the Norwegian system has a completely different level of experience collaborating with Russia than if it had been Denmark or Sweden or Iceland. That would have been much more challenging. And Norway stands out from the rest of Europe, from the rest of the Nordic countries, from the rest of Europe. And the fact that Norway and Russia are neighbors up here, and I didn't mention the fisheries collaboration. Since the mid-1970s, Norway and Russia, the Soviet Union, now Russia, has very, very efficient and productive fisheries collaboration concerning the Barents Sea. And it's one of the things that Norway made clear it was going to continue and it was going to preserve that collaboration. And I think many people in the rest of Europe, they don't understand why Norway continues this minimal collaboration. So you have these differences, and then you have to remember the 8 Arctic states. You have the superpower of the international system, the United States, because of Alaska. The United States behaves like a superpower in the Arctic, anywhere else in the world. You have Russia, which, I mean, we in the West, we forgot to think about Russia as a great power. And it doesn't matter if we don't think it's a great power. They think they're a great power, and I think they are a great power, and they think and behave like a great power. Then you have Canada, middle power, of course, incredibly dependent on the United States. And then you have the 5 Nordic countries, which are textbook examples of small states in the international system. And they behave like that.
Great. Well, then now we can talk a little bit about the observer states of Arctic Council, like those non-Arctic states. Let's talk about China. I think during China's application for observer states to Arctic Council, I think Norway is welcoming, and then Norway respond positively to China's 2018 Arctic Policy White Paper. Has Norway's perception of policy on China has evolved or changed in the recent years? And then another question related to is Norway sharing the same concern as the United States? Because the US see the China-Russia cooperation as a challenge to the Arctic security and geopolitics. What is Norway's perception on this?
I think the Arctic always reflects international order and what goes on more broadly in the international system. And when we had the Cold War, bipolar international system, we had bipolar Arctic. When we had unipolarity after the Cold War, American unipolarity was the basis of the Arctic Council and all this kind of collaboration. And of course, we had after the Cold War, we had globalization, which many people benefited from. And of course, China was an enormously important actor in globalization, and also globalization was very beneficial to China. That globalization contributed to the spectacular growth and development of Chinese economy and society the last 40 plus years. And during this time, I mean, I mentioned the Western perceptions that after the Cold War, it was supposed to be the end of history and everybody was supposed to end up like the West and adapting to Western system. And I mean, I myself, since 2012, I've been very involved in first Danish-Chinese academic collaboration and then Chinese-Nordic academic collaboration. And the expectations back then, it was very much this globalization, it was very much end of history. And then, of course, history didn't develop the way it was supposed to develop. And first, the United States, it realizes that China is the main threat to US unipolar position. China is the only peer competitor to the United States. And the United States is determined to remain the only superpower in the world. And China, the Chinese population is 3.5 times US population. So of course, if China continues growing, the Chinese economy is going to be twice the US economy. It's going to be maybe 3 times the US economy. And that, of course, the United States is never, ever going to accept. That's why the United States does everything to contain China today. And of course, a part of that containment is to try and cut China off politically, economically, scientifically, technologically from other people. And it brings us back to this European and Nordic deep dependence on the United States, intellectual dependence, material dependence. So when the United States changes view about China, when the United States wants to isolate China all it can, different places in the world, including in Europe, including in the Nordics, including in the Arctic, well, it's basically up to Europe, it's up to the Nordics to think independently about what is our relationship with China, what are our interests, what should our relationship with China look like. I don't think the Europeans, I don't think the Nordics are very good at thinking independently about that. I think Europe and the Nordics, to a large extent, have imported a US view of China, which very much reflects the superpower interest in suppressing, containing any peer competitor, which now happens to be China. And as I say, I'm very skeptical if Europe and the Nordics share those interests. But I think over the last 10, 15, 20 years, I think we've seen a huge shift from this optimism of globalization, where there was so much optimism in engaging with China scientifically, technologically, commercially, and now there's so much reticence. And I mean, personally, other people will think differently. Personally, I think Europe and the Nordics largely have adopted American perspectives, and I don't think the Europeans and the Nordics have sat down and asked themselves, what are our interests?
Understand. So I'm just wondering, are there still any Chinese investment in Norway, say energy exploration area or port corporation? And what is the attitude and how the Norwegian government or public see the China's investment or potential interest investment in the Norwegian Arctic?
Europe and the Nordics have become extremely reticent, extremely skeptical of Chinese partnerships, investments. And I mean, you have to think carefully about questions of critical infrastructure, different technologies. I mean, China is scientifically, technologically, it's such an advanced country today that the widespread thought many places in the West that if we cut scientific technological ties to China, then we stop technology spreading from the West to China. I think that ship has sailed. Now it's a question of mutual learning. But you want to be very careful about questions of critical infrastructure, etc. But yeah, I mean, the great optimism of engaging with China, it has been replaced by a lot of reticence. And I mean, China is, of course, China and the United States are the world's by far two largest economies, and China should and could become much, much bigger. The two largest technology systems, China and India, are the two largest populations in the world. There, I think the Europeans, I think the Nordics, they should think carefully about what are our interests and how do we relate to one of the world's largest economies, one of the world's largest science and technology systems, one of the world's largest populations. But one thing which is extremely interesting to view, of course, China probably leads the world concerning electrical vehicles. And you do see just earlier today here in Tromsø, I passed one of these very, very nice Chinese electrical cars. I think it's called Hongqi. Beautiful car. I happen to know that the Chinese ambassador in Copenhagen drives such a car. And you see a lot of the BYD cars here. And of course, Chinese electrical vehicles are very, very competitive. But a modern car, an electrical vehicle, it's a smartphone on wheels. And it's a sensor platform. And I mean, back in the 70s, 80s, something like that, when Toyota and Mazda and Japanese car makers, when they were killing European and North American car industry, that was a purely economic problem about employment, balance of trade, stuff like that. It was not a security problem, because a 1980s Toyota was a completely passive mechanical product. But of course, one of these BYDs or Hongqi or what they're called, they are very sophisticated sensor platforms. And I mean, any society has to think about, is it comfortable with having a lot of foreign sensor platforms driving around society? And I mean, I had a conversation with a very, very brilliant and senior Chinese colleague, and I said to this colleague, I mean, with completely free trade in electrical vehicles, I don't know, very quickly half the vehicles in Europe would be Chinese electrical vehicles, and can we accept that half the vehicles are sophisticated sensor platforms where we don't fully understand what is happening? And I said to this colleague, well, I mean, would China tolerate that half the vehicles in China were US sensor platforms? And of course, as this senior Chinese colleague said, then of course China would never tolerate that. So these technologies, they pose new questions that has to be considered very carefully.
I understand the concern of the rationale behind that. And then I'm curious, are there any academic or research exchange between your university and also other university in China that conduct a study on the Arctic? Very quick.
Of course, UIT is a member of the China Nordic Arctic Research Center. China Nordic Arctic Research Center, placed at the Polar Research Institute of China in Pudong, Shanghai, founded in 2013. I think UIT became a member in 18, maybe. And I have followed China Nordic Arctic Research Center since 2014 and participated a lot. Of course, the pandemic was extremely difficult for societies around the world, not least China. But the pandemic, it cut so much collaboration. It cut so many ties, and it has been very, very hard to restart this collaboration after the pandemic. I mean, to see the activity in CNARC from 2023 and onwards, I see strong Chinese interest commitment. And the Nordics, they seem to, and it reflects this reticence I talked about before, that the Nordics seem to, they seem to be very uncertain about what to do and how to participate in this kind of collaboration with China. And I mean, at the CNARC meeting in Guangzhou in December 23, I was the only person from my university. At the there was a few people at the next 24 meeting in Iceland. Now there was a CNAC meeting in Shanghai in April this year. I could not be there. I really wanted to be there, but I needed to be here. I'm not quite sure who was there from my university. And one thing that's extremely concerning is that 10 years ago, you would see a lot of young academics, PhD students, postdocs. You would see them engaged in this China collaboration. And now when I go to these things, I'm often one of the youngest persons from the Nordic sides, and I'm not as young as I look.
I hope I will be able to see you more often in China-based academic conferences in the near future. My last question is about the Norway's role in the Arctic Council. During the past 2 years, when Norway paid the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, I'm just wondering, without Russia's participation, strategy does Norway take to move around to push the functionality of the Arctic Council? And then the related question. Okay, are there any back channel communication with Russia? And because I understand many of the SENTI projects actually involve Russia participation. And now with the chairmanship of Arctic Council taken by Denmark, is there any legacy that Norway think it should stay with the Arctic Council? Thank you.
Well, I mean, personally, I have to say I'm extremely impressed that the Arctic Council survived. I thought the Arctic Council was gone. And I think there were very, very strong forces pushing to kick Russia out in 2022. I was interviewed myself about that a number of times in media, and I usually pointed to two things. One thing was that be very careful about humiliating a great power. And even though we may not accept Russia as a great power, Russia itself thinks it's a great power. And great powers, they don't respond well to humiliations. And the other thing I said was that don't overestimate Russia's interest in the Arctic Council. We talked about how Russia is so enormous. Sometimes I joke to students and I say that Russia has more Arctic itself that it knows what to do with. And a lot of this collaboration in the 1990s, Arctic Council, International Arctic Science Committee, et cetera, I think a lot of that collaboration was exactly for the West to gain access to the Russian Arctic. I'm not sure how interested Russia is in other people's Arctic, because as I say, they got it all themselves. I think China may have played an important role preserving the Arctic Council. In October 22, at the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, on the main stage, the Chinese representative Gao Feng, he was interviewed by the former president of Iceland, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, and Gao Feng, he says that China will not, I mean, I don't remember exactly what he says, but I think he says to the effect that China will not recognize an Arctic Council that doesn't have the full participation of all members. And I think that was a very important message to give the 7 other members. I think very, very easily, the 7 others, they could have ended up with what I call the half Arctic Council. 7 out of 8, that sounds like a big majority, but we have to keep in mind that Russia is half the Arctic. So 7 out of 8, it's half the Arctic. And there, I think some very, very impressive diplomatic work was put into maintaining, preserving the Arctic Council. But I also think the reality is that it has been preserved by the West continuously backing down. I mean, the West takes very strong steps in March, I think it's March 2022, and the West has been continuously retreating from that. And I think Russia has kept a very, how do you say, a very cool stance, mainly just waiting for the West to back down from its positions. And of course, it's it's not popular to say in the West that the West has backed down. And of course, there's so little activity. There's so little activity now. But the council is still alive. For example, the Barents Council, the Barents Corporation, that is gone. And as far as my understanding is, the sequence of events was that Finland had the chairmanship of the Barents Council, and then Russia was next in line, and Finland refused to pass on the chairship to Russia. And then, of course, Russia responded by withdrawing. I mean, often in the Nordic side, we only hear the part of the story where Russia withdraws, and not what I think is the first part of the story, that Finland refuses to hand over the chairship. And there, I'm very impressed with the diplomats who managed to keep the Arctic Council alive. And I think, again, I suspect that Norway's very important experience working with Russia has been maybe a necessary condition to keep the Arctic Council alive. And the Kingdom of Denmark, and it's very important to say the Kingdom of Denmark, and the Kingdom of Denmark chairship is overwhelmingly dominated by Greenland. It is very much Greenland in the driving seat of that. And the Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland, has very little connection, Arctic connection with Russia, very little. Of course, that was very much the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland very much turned to the West, turned to the United States, Canada. Now that has become extremely difficult with Trump and his desire to take over Greenland. I suspect the I suspect the Kingdom of Denmark chairship will focus very much on indigenous peoples. That, of course, is something that's a great interest to Greenland. It also does give it gives some interesting possibilities concerning the connection with Russia, because indigenous peoples are usually cross-border. All the except the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, RIPON, all the other permanent participants in the Arctic Council are cross-border. And of course, in northern Scandinavia, the Sami, it's northern Norway, northern Sweden, northern Finland, and northwest Russia. The Inuit Circumpolar Council, it's Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and northeast tip of Russia. And you have the Aleutians, the Aleutian Islands, which are both the United States and Russia. So 3 out of the permanent participants, they are cross-border to Russia. So perhaps that gives some possibilities during the Kingdom of Denmark chairship.
Thank you. That's very informative and insightful. I do share the same hope with you that Arctic Council function as its desire. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bertelsen, for joining me for this conversation, which brings us a lot of issues that were covered during the past hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your invitation.